If you want to see the land ride again, oh, it's the magic boomerang. It's a wonder it ever makes it back again.
It's some compensation for those people who care, I suppose, that the Monday morning train from Adelaide to Port Pirie nearly always leaves on time. Compensation because further north it's almost certain we'll fall behind schedule considerably. That's the way it is. Of course, this section of the trip can only be loosely regarded as the Ghan. From here to Port Pirie it's broad gauge, then from Port Pirie to Marree it's the standard gauge line, and finally from Marree to Alice Springs is what the old-timers call the real Ghan, the narrow gauge, and that's when the fun begins. And that's why they call it an unfolding adventure. "30 minutes from the city and just past the outskirts of Adelaide's northern suburbs. Yet even if this isn't the official Ghan, merely the name of our first stop, Two Wells, already oozes connotations of the places which lie ahead on the trek north. Three and a half hours after leaving Adelaide and several stops later, the rail yards of Port Pirie, where we'll change to the standard gauge train. A few carriages belonging to other famous trains, including the Indian Pacific, sit idly against a drab industrial background. The changeover is a second-nature affair and will be completed quickly. The conductors and waiters look incongruous in their bow ties, but immediately create a mood of yesteryear which will infect everyone over the next 2 days. The further north you travel, the more Ghanified you become.
Springs only, first class.
Better be for lunch.
Oh, yeah, do. Great. Just shipped it.
Yeah.
Thank you. First call for lunch, please. First call for lunch. Anybody requiring lunch, please?
Lunch is always the first step of the second leg out of Port Pirie. It's after leaving Port Augusta at the tip of Spencer Gulf in South Australia that the trip starts to really change complexion. These days, the departure doesn't even ruffle the locals' feathers, but a century ago, the building of the first line was bread and butter to most people in the area, and part of a South Australian dream to annex the Northern Territory and build a railroad from the Southern Ocean to the Arafura Sea, thus bisecting and controlling the entire central region of Australia. Despite several attempts at working north-south simultaneously, it remained the dream of an ill-advised and inept government. Then in 1878, 16 years after the first statutes were prepared, the narrow gauge line headed towards the Flinders Ranges and Pitchy Ritchie Pass, unlike this line, which was used from 1956 to overcome the inadequacies of the narrow gauge. This stretch of line that I'm walking across here is the old line that runs into Port Augusta, about 25 miles southwest of here. It's in the middle of Pitchy Ritchie Pass, and it's here that the Pitchy Ritchie Preservation Society is keeping the line and some of the old carriages and locomotives intact, that is, the original steam engines. But that's not all they're looking after. They're preserving, too, this beautiful stonework that exists all the way through these hills. Each stone was placed by hand meticulously, and there's no cement, no mortar used at all. Ostensibly, the railway was built as a service to people pioneering the area, but many argued it was through the political pressure of certain prominent pastoralists that it took the back-breaking route through the ranges and within a stone's throw of certain properties. The first stretch of track was opened a year and a half after work started. It covered the 40 kilometres to the town of Quorn, which prospered as a result. A year later, it had reached Hawker. Then a year after that, in 1881, was through to the centre known as Beltana. Today, Beltana is all but forgotten. The railway station is a shop for tourists, and the trappings of its former status, like the town's name on the station wall, are barely discernible. The old freight shed stands idle, a far cry from its heyday. In those days, a century ago, the town was the base for development of the line. 1,000 construction navvies invaded it, offering profits on one hand, but violence on the other. Settlers in Beltana, fearing such violence, had demanded that a police station and lockup be built. It wasn't long before it was in constant use, because the hotels in the town were well patronised. Drunkenness, disturbing the peace, and rowdyism were commonplace. The townsfolk were also worried by large-scale desertions from gangs of men who simply walked off the job. Some disappeared, others returned after a few days, and many, probably trying to make their way south again, lurked in the bush outside Beltana and raided stores and homes for food and money. If violence and intimidation weren't enough for the settlers, death from sickness and accident seemed to be prevalent. But Beltana represented the era in which there were massacres of whites by blacks and vice versa. Afghan camel drivers succumbing to the harsh desert environment. Navvies who died or were killed near the railway line. Death was often the price to pay in developing the outback, not only with the railway, but earlier with the overland telegraph. For much of the time, it was nothing more than a torturous slog. Cuttings like this one were dug by hand. Concrete for bridges and culverts was mixed by hand on boards. Extra ballast in the form of stones was collected by Afghan workers and left in piles for the navvies to collect later. How futile it would all seem to those men now that the rails have long since been removed and the few reminders left to rot in the searing heat. How many navvies must have pondered the sense of battling the Flinders Rangers as they laboured here to give the train a free run back down to the plains where the line is today and where it probably should have been built then. From here, the history of Beltana and the original line is well hidden by the Rangers, so that it passes unnoticed in the late afternoon routine on the standard gauge Ghan.
So it's 6:15 for...
6:15 dinner tonight.
What about breakfast?
That'll be 7:30, roughly 8:15.
I'll have to hold on to these because if we lose them, you don't get any dinner.
From there we were going to the Far East and going on to Mosquitoes to do the same work. And right in the middle of it, the war stopped. Well, actually not in the middle of it. The war stopped on the night of our last operational exercise.
The train is flanked by the Flinders Rangers most of the way from Port Augusta to Marree. There are few towns of any size, but the line is lightly strewn with the stark huts of fettlers' camps, built to house the men who service the standard gauge railway. They alternate and contrast with remnants of the original narrow gauge line. now running parallel for much of the journey. It's now a straightforward run with the possibility of a stop for a coal train from Lee Creek as the only likely diversion. Otherwise, it's full steam ahead. It's at this first sitting of dinner you get to know the people you'll be sharing your meals with until Alice Springs.
Now the beef. Beef for you, sir. Veggies. Makes your hair curly. That's what my mum always told me anyway. I don't have to use my rollers anymore now. Everybody happy?
Yeah, a friend of mine is a vet. He does a trip every second month to Warrina, Algebuckina and back to Lee Creek. I'm also an assistant vet.
Get used to seeing it, wouldn't you? What made you come over here, Joyce?
We wanted to see Alice Springs. We want to see the camels. Here there's camels up there, and there's native Aborigines. So we wanted to go up there.
Too much about camels, they give you the hump. I've been retired 5 years, and it's something I've got to do. You must go on the Ghan. If you don't do it this year, you'll never do it.
The longer the evening shadows become, the more the microcosm within the carriages is established, and the more the passengers relax. The changeover at Marree is about 4 hours away, and with it, the luxury of a sleeping berth on what the old-timers regard as the real Ghan, with its 3-foot 6-inch narrow-gauge track.